Hi Year 11, I'm going to quickly give you some feedback and final tips for the exam on Thursday for your unseen literature paper. And we're just going to talk about the poetry question. Even though there will be a prose question as an option, we have only ever taught you the poetry, and we strongly recommend you only do the poetry question. And you obviously do one question on Thursday. So a few final tips to ensure that you are prepared for this exam. Firstly, everything that you have done in the last 2 years to prepare for poetry and Life of Pi has given you the skills necessary to be able to answer this question effectively. So you might actually want to return to my previous video for the final literature tips feedback. And you might want to look through your notes and your work on poetry, because what you have done for the anthology is ultimately what you are doing here, but you are just doing it with a poem you haven't been taught. So as we have taught you in lessons, when we're annotating the poems and we're annotating them in a huge amount of detail and discussing them in a huge amount of detail, that's what you now need to mimic in your planning stage for this exam. And it's also a longer exam, which incorporates more planning time, but it also incorporates slightly more time for you to actually write compared to the poetry anthology exam. And that gives you the final opportunity to put together a perfect literature essay where you are able to develop lots and lots of analysis and include lots of analysis and talk about the poem as a whole. So it's definitely not extra time for you not to do work in. Your pen still needs to be on that paper for the whole hour and 15 minutes. It's just giving you more time to have an opportunity to put together the perfect essay. So the exam will look something like this. You are advised to spend about 20 minutes reading the question paper and planning your answer. It will say answer either question 1 or question 2. Question 1 is normally the poem, and that's what you will be answering. 1, read carefully the following poem, and the poem will be printed below. It will always give you a slight explanation of what the poem is about. The poet is explaining to his young son why he stays up late at night writing his poems. It has the question in bold. So how does the poet's writing make his thoughts and feelings so vivid for you? So in this particular paper, they actually gave you both the adjective vivid and thoughts and feelings. So a relatively broad question. And then you get the 3 bullet points, and I'm going to talk about those 3 bullet points in a second. But let's just start with the timings for this exam. If your exam starts exactly at 9 a.m, you have been advised to spend 20 minutes reading and planning. Don't just take that as advice, that is compulsory. Take every minute of those 20 minutes to plan and write. None of you should be picking up a pen and writing your essay before, let's say if it starts at 9, before 9:20. Utilize that time. Every single examiner's report from CIE mentioned the fact that lower marked essays were because they were not planned. And the impact of not planning is that you end up perhaps writing quite a lot, but a lot of it is repetitive or convoluted or contradictory when you realize that the meaning of the poem is something different to what you started. So the main thing you must do is not do anything but plan for 20 minutes. You have to think of it as what we have done in class before, and that's the level of detail now that you are planning. It's not the same as the poetry anthology. So my recommendation for timings are 20 minutes of planning, a 5-minute introduction at most, and then 15 minutes per paragraph. And I think you need to be really strict with your timings because, again, lots of the examiner's reports mention that weaker candidates left the final bullet point or the final paragraph right till the end, which often focuses on the end of the poem, and left out maybe a change in meaning or a change in tone, and they missed out an insightful moment of interpretation, and that limited their marks. So I think it's very, very important to cut yourself off after 15 minutes and move on every single time. Leave just a few minutes, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes for a brief conclusion, which I'll talk about. and a very quick review of what you have written. I've only said 2.5 minutes review because really, as you're writing, and with kind of 45-50 minutes of writing, you should be going at a pace where you are stopping, reading what you have written, and making sure the next sentence makes sense. You're kind of rereading it over and over again. So there shouldn't be lots of time left at the end, because ultimately you're not going to be able to make major edits. You should be reading it and reviewing it as you go. So let's talk about these bullet points a little bit more, because there is a potential opportunity to get slightly tripped up on the question and the bullet points. So if your question is, how does the poet make his thoughts and feelings vivid for you? It's very similar to poetry anthology. You revert that question, or you change that question slightly to get your arguments. What is the poet's thoughts and feelings? What are the poet's thoughts and feelings in this poem? That's really the question. And the bullet points direct you to your evidence. So to help you answer this question, you might consider the poet's description of his son at the rock pool, how he explains to his son his experience of writing, and how he connects the nature of the two experiences. Usually the bullet points are indicating, the first one pushes you to kind of the beginning of the poem, middle of the poem, and end of the poem. And these are just recommendations and suggestions. You do not have to follow those bullet points exactly. And those bullet points are definitely not your points. So your first paragraph, if this was your question, should not read, the poet describes his son's experience at the rock pool as, because that means that you have forgotten about the question. If you want to use the bullet points, then my recommendation is always to simply use them as kind of a direction to your evidence. And so I always say add the word through. So when you're reading that question and you're planning, instead you say, how does the poet's writing make his thoughts and feelings so vivid through the description of his son at the rock pool? So that helps you still answer the question, what are his thoughts and feelings, but it's just directing that particular paragraph to that part of the poem. It is really important. You don't forget about the question, whatever it may be, and think that the bullet points are what you are answering. They are not your points. They are not your arguments. Don't make that mistake, please. Okay, so obviously you will then spend 20 minutes planning, and your poem might be much longer than this particular one on the specimen paper. It might be a similar length. It might be completely different. You might have a question about thoughts and feelings. You might have something that says just an effect. So how does the poet make this poem particularly memorable, striking, vivid, dramatic, emotional, any of those words that CIE I like to use. And just as you did with your literature exam, you focus on the question. The question is what you are answering, and everything you now look at when you look at the poem is about the question. So my advice for your plan is to firstly just read the poem once for meaning. What is this poem about? What do you think it means at the beginning? And make notes as you go. Because whilst your interpretation at the beginning might be something different to your second reading, you want to explore and explain different interpretations. So it doesn't mean your first interpretation is wrong, but your second interpretation, you want to show both of them. You want to show maybe how your interpretation changed as you read it, or how the tone changed. So read the poem once for meaning, and then read it again with the question in mind. So read the poem, make sure you have a general understanding of what it is about, make notes on that, and then go back to the question and start annotating it like we used to do in class, like we have done in all the other poetry videos, and think, okay, where is all the evidence for the poet's thoughts and feelings for this particular paper? And you go through line by line and you find every moment of evidence for his thoughts and feelings, and you track how they change. And just like we have always done, you find your 3 changes. So initially at the beginning, what are the poet's thoughts and feelings? how does that change? By the end, how does that change? You might have 3 paragraphs, you might have 4 paragraphs. You might be led by the bullet points to look at the descriptions of the rock pool, the experience of the writing, and the connection of the two. But the bullet points really normally split the poem up as we would have split it up anyway. It just helps you with that. So you've read the poem twice and your annotations are starting to develop. You've got your 2 lines splitting the poem into 3. You've got your kind of 3-point plan ready to go, and that is constantly answering the question, not the bullet points. And then you read it again and again, making sure that you have your language analysis annotated. And again, you're not just randomly annotating techniques. If your your first paragraph is that the poet's thoughts and feelings are one of nostalgia and sadness at the beginning, then you're going to look, okay, where are the writer's choices to make that? Where are the metaphors, the similes, the personification, the interesting verbs and words that have made that thought or feeling? So there is no point just reading the poem randomly and annotating every technique that you know. The question must be at the forefront of your mind when you are analysing, and you are only analysing evidence and highlighting evidence that proves your point to answer that question. And don't forget the end of the poem either. As I said before, the end of the poem will have something insightful to say. So in this particular poem, the writer comes to the realization that he can use his child's, he can be inspired by his child's imagination to write himself. And there's a moment of kind of hope perhaps at the end. And so you want to make sure that you are finding that insight and you're not just forgetting about the end of the poem. So as you're annotating, a few questions that you might ask yourself are what might the emotions be that are conveyed to the reader? Literary texts aim for an emotive effect of some sort. Now, you might be given that in your question, which is nice and easy. You might be asked to look for emotion. How does this poet make it emotional, dramatic, whatever that might be? Or you might have a broad question like the specimen paper. What are the thoughts and feelings? And in that case, you have to answer that question, but also think, what is this poet trying to make me feel as a reader, or a reader in general? So if we just scroll back up to the specimen paper, whilst his thoughts and feelings are of nostalgia and sadness, we might also feel those things, but we might also feel sympathy for our speaker. We might feel joy when they find hope at the end. So there can be slightly different answers. What is the mood of the poem? And does it change? That might be helpful in finding your 3 points as well. What could the tone be? How could it be spoken aloud? What type of tone would you have to put on? If there is figurative language, which there will be, what does it actually symbolize? Again, we're not just identifying metaphors and similes, we're thinking about what the comparison is and what overall this poet is trying to symbolize through his figurative language. And that moves on to the last point, what is the deeper meaning and the bigger picture? So if, for example, you get a poem on Thursday about someone swimming, it's obviously not just a poem about swimming. Perhaps it might be about humans and nature and how they interact in a positive or in a negative light. Perhaps it's about something even more than that. So we don't just look at the literal thing that is being told to us. We do think beyond that. We look at the bigger picture. We think of these writers sitting down and putting these poems together and what ultimately they really want us to feel and to think by the end of that poem. So your language and structural analysis, again, you might just want to return to the previous video that I did for feedback because it will be very similar as you have done in your poetry analysis. So it's essential that you show your understanding of the poem throughout your analysis. You need to talk about language, you need to talk about structure, you need to ensure that you're talking about poetic techniques and you're not talking about narration or anything to do with prose. you've got to explain your interpretations. Again, I keep saying, but it's not enough just to identify random techniques and not explain how you've got to an interpretation that then answers the question. It's all a cycle. It all comes back to the question. If you write without a plan, your analysis won't be clear. You will become repetitive, you will pick random quotations, there won't be a clear structure, and ultimately your analysis won't be focused. So we're never going to walk into that exam and write without a plan. And a few key tips for your analysis, which we've said time and time again, perhaps is your keyword. Throughout your essay, the word perhaps should crop up time and time again. Don't worry if it sounds a little repetitive, because everything you're saying is an interpretation. You don't know anything for certain about what the writer intended. You can only analyze. So it's particularly good if you get a tricky poem on Thursday and you're not sure about it, then we use words like perhaps this could mean this, or perhaps it could mean this. And that allows you to not only explore different interpretations, but not attach yourself to a singular answer. And as long as you explain that, you include references that support it, then you're going to get marks for analysis, because that is what this question is asking of you. And just a few things that CIE have said in their examiner's report. To remember that imagery is not just sensory descriptions. Imagery is figurative language, it's metaphors, similes, personification. So don't just think of imagery as something vivid in your mind that's one of the five senses. It's all of those things. And when you're talking about those things, you need to think about what is being compared. So if there is a metaphor, that means that one thing is being directly compared to something else. And you've got to think about, why is it that particular metaphor? Why wasn't it something else? What is the overall meaning of that? What does it symbolize? What's the writer trying to get at? What could they have said instead, but they didn't? And that's the level of depth you need to go into when you're planning and then when you're writing. Structure analysis, again, this might be something that you do really need to revise for Thursday. And that's different forms and different structures that a poem might take. But as always, and as I've said in the previous video, start simply. Is it regular? Is it irregular? What's the meaning of the poem, and how can you attach the meaning of the poem to the structure? You might only explicitly talk about the structure once, and that's absolutely fine. Perhaps try and get it out the way in the first paragraph. If it's regular, is it mirroring a message of calm and peace and order, or something positive? If it's irregular, is it as simple as it mirroring a message of chaos or disorder or breaking free from something? Or is it actually contradictory? And that's really the only two questions you need to ask yourself in the exam. And then when you have a point in your essay that is perhaps talking about the chaos of something, then you can talk about the irregularity of the structure. And then you move on. It really is just one point of explicit analysis. And ultimately you will be talking about the structure anyway, because you'll have sectioned up the poem and you'll talk about the beginning and the middle and how it ends anyway. And you'll get those structural points implicitly. But you do want to make sure there is at least one kind of explicit reference to the regularity or irregularity of your structure. So my key tip for you when you're referencing and when you're analysing is my what I call quickfire phrase, and just to use this order as much as possible. Now, obviously your essay is not going to read just random sentences saying the technique, embed your quote, could imply this, but you're going to balance discussing the meaning of the poem and answering the question with analysis. And I think the best way to embed your analysis is to follow this technique, this sentence structure in some way. The technique, whatever that is, comma, embed your reference, could imply, and that could is tentative, which opens you up for interpretation, opens your argument up to perhaps analyze one thread and then move on and say, or perhaps it could mean this. So the metaphor, embed your quotation, could imply blah, 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 blah. And if you do that 5, 6, 7 times in a paragraph and your technique is often different, you know that you're getting marks for analysis, as long as the thing that comes after the quotation makes sense and it is clear and it answers the question. And CIE in their examiners' reports have said previously, the quality of an analytical comment which follows the quotation is the key discriminator between weak candidates and strong candidates. So the thing that comes after each of your references, each of your quotes, is the thing that they're going to decide whether you are strong or weak. So you need to be very, very careful with that. And the strong candidates comment on the effect of writing and explore the reasons for a writer's choice. So you really are focusing and engaging on that specific technique that you have picked out and why it shows the poet's thought and feeling as sad or whatever it is that you are discussing. Strong candidates comment on what language reveals about tone and mood of the text. So these are the things that you really need to include consistently in your answer. And one thing actually I just remembered that I want to say, when CIE say what follows the quotation is the key discriminator, is really important, because sometimes in your literature essays in the past, you will talk about a quotation and kind of ramble on about something, or you've included that quotation early in the sentence, discuss something else, and then you go back to that quotation and your analysis becomes kind of jumbled and convoluted. Whereas if you just follow this very simple, clear sentence structure, then you can't go wrong. You can't analyze anything other than that specific technique. And the quotation shouldn't really be longer than 3 words. Okay, moving on to actually what we are writing. Introductions are actually really important for this paper. CIE reference introductions in every single examiner's report they have published for the unseen paper. So my recommendation is always follow the same structure again. The first sentence, what is happening in this poem? Give some kind of summary, brief summary, just to show your full understanding of it. Second sentence, what is your 3-point answer? Give a very brief overview of where your essay is going. Third sentence, completely optional and only if you actually have something important to say. But perhaps you can give an overview of what you think the writer's perspective or purpose is, and that's kind of looking at the bigger picture. What do you think the final message of that poem is? Why did the writer write it? What might the poem actually mean? And just to take some phrases from CIE's examiner's report, you should practice writing excellent introductions. So you might want to look at some past papers before Thursday morning and practice those intros. Avoid repeating the terms of the question and the bullet points. Do not provide a list of literary terms in your intro. We have been telling you that for years, but another reminder, you are not to reference or include any literary terms in your introduction. Keep those for your analysis in your paragraphs, and avoid just repeating the question, and definitely don't repeat the bullet points, because everyone can do that. That's the easiest thing that you could do in this exam. But if you want to get the highest marks and show like a personal response and an insightful response, you don't have to follow that rigid structure of repeating the question word for word. So, for example, for the specimen paper, an introduction might read, in the poem, Why Do You Stay Up So Late? The speaker converses with his child and reminisces on times when the games they would play on the beach and how the child's imagination and creativity would inspire him to write, and also remind him of his lack of imagination. The speaker explores feelings of nostalgia, envy, and sadness as he struggles to find his own childish imagination. Perhaps the writer is writing to his child and thanking him for inspiring his own writing. Too many writings in that last sentence, but you get the idea. First sentence, quick summary. What is this poem about? I'm showing the examiner I understand all of it. Second sentence, very brief summary. I'm going to talk about nostalgia, then I'm going to talk about envy, and then I'm going to talk about sadness. That's my essay plan. Final sentence, perhaps, and I'm just adding a little flair of why I think the writer is writing. Again, this is from literature, so you don't necessarily need to be reminded of this, but just in case, make sure your paragraphs start off with some flair. Again, try not to immediately repeat the question. Try not to have that clunky in this poem. The writer explores his vivid thoughts and feelings as. If you feel like that's just better for you because that will allow you to write a clear paragraph, fine. But some other ways that you might open your paragraphs are initially the poem or speaker explores, and then you obviously link back to the question. Perhaps the most, and I put affect there, depending on what the question is, it might be dramatic, vivid, emotional, whatever the question is directing you to. Interestingly, the speaker, that's a nice way to immediately get into analysis and answer the question. And then for a final paragraph, ultimately by the end of the poem, and you can still answer the question, but ultimately by the end of the poem, the speaker's explores the thoughts and feelings of guilt or whatever it is you're talking about. So ensure that your opening sentences always answer the question, and they shouldn't really ever be repeating the bullet points, and try and just add that flair to make sure you're standing out from just repeating the essay question again and again. As in your literature essays, you get marks for references. CIE say to engage with an unseen text requires frequent but brief quotations. Because of the length of this exam, you can talk a lot more about smaller quotations, and you should really be tracking through the poem and picking out as many references as possible. Rarely, unless it's an incredibly long poem, should there be a line that goes without being analysed, and whether that's just a small word from it, but you should be picking out as much as possible that is relevant to the question. So your quotations should be introduced or followed by valid interpretation and argument, with exploration of how the language of the quotation supports that argument. It is important that quotations should support points about the meaning of the text and introduce exploration of language, tone, effectiveness of writers. You can't write an essay, a literary essay, without quotations. They allow you to analyse the language, they must be there. Something I noted from one of the examiner's reports, which I thought was interesting, they mentioned talking about enjambment. And when referencing it, you have to quote it, of course, and you must follow the line over to show your full understanding of enjambment. It's not good enough to have the last two words of one line. You need to actually show evidence of enjambment, and therefore you need to go over to the other line. And finally, in your planning, the best candidates for this exam will match up quotations. So if you are talking about the speaker feeling angry and you have violent verbs, you might find those violent verbs throughout the poem, not just in the first stanza or what you're focusing on, and you merge them together in one point of analysis rather than repeating yourself over and over again. That's a really important point for getting top marks. And the personal response element of this question, same as literature and Life of Pi, you should be critical and evaluative in your analysis. You are not writing a summary of what the poem means. You are evaluating what the poem means. You have to understand that the text is a construct and a writer has sat down and created it. And they've crossed certain words out and they've edited it and they've chosen metaphors, and that's their final edit. And there's a reason for that being their final edit in front of you, and you are picking that apart and thinking about why they chose the choices that they did and what the final effect you think they wanted to explore and show. Which is why you have to consider different reasons, different interpretations, different effects. And that's why the word perhaps is so important. Perhaps this means this, perhaps the writer chose the imagery because, and that's where you then get to your individual and insightful interpretations, because not everyone is going to read the poem in the same way. That's the point of literature. But really do look at the end of the poem. Make sure you leave those 15 minutes of a whole paragraph to focus on the end, and try and find something different at the end of the poem, something insightful that changes the meaning of it, or changes the tone of it, or changes the mood of it. Your conclusion, I think a conclusion can be done in a sentence, maybe in two, and it's really leaving your essay and your examiner with a final moment of your personal response to the poem, a final point of evaluation. It is not repeating the intro, and it is not repeating the three things that you've just said already. It's something slightly different. So some sentence starters that might help you are: the poem seems to be, and that might be: the poem seems to be a message to adults about being inspired by their children, and it in the end is a hopeful poem that adults can return to childhood, something like that. Or ultimately the poem is, and that might be what the final message you think the poem is about. Or you might simply focus on a singular thing, particularly if your question is, how does the poet create a striking poem? You might say the most striking moment in this whole poem was. And you might have just a nice personal response at the end of indicating what you think the best or the best part of that effect that you're looking at was. And the exam board say the best conclusions contained quotations and comments that nailed insight in the overall effect of the entire poem. So it really kind of, I think what they mean by that, it nails the final personal response. What is this poem all about? What is the big picture? What is the message? What not to do? I think I've said all of these things, but just to make sure, do not skip planning. Do not write for the full 75 minutes. CIE are very, very clear that anything too lengthy is actually kind of detrimental to your marks. Anything over kind of 1,300 words if you're typing is way too much. And you shouldn't be writing that much, because you should only really be writing for about 45 to 50 minutes, the rest of the time planning. Do not attach interpretations where there is no evidence. If you cannot fill the sentence the technique might imply, and you don't know what the end of that sentence is, you've probably picked the wrong quote and you've probably picked the wrong kind of interpretation. Do not attach meaning where it isn't there. Do not make sweeping statements without clear explanation. Again, if you can't quite explain it, then it's probably not right, and you need to find something that is easy to explain. Do not talk about any interpretation with certainty, because you don't know. So we use our tentative language: perhaps, might, could. Try not to read the poem too literally or too metaphorically. Make sure you're understanding that the poem has literal moments and metaphorical moments, and you need to be able to differentiate between the two. Your essay is not a summary. It is a critical analysis. You must be answering the question in everything that you write about. And don't get stuck in a rigid kind of box where you think you must do this answer in a certain way and there is only one right answer. The whole point of this exam is giving you freedom for personal interpretation. Stick to kind of our essay structure, but the content of it, as long as there's evidence and you can explain it and you can explore it, that is the right answer. Some things that you might want to add to your revision are structural points that perhaps you haven't looked at so much since last week's exam. So could you spot free verse, enjambment and end stops and think about what their effect is? Could you spot regular and irregular poetic structures, sonnet structures, caesura, the effect of soft and harsh sounds? These are all structural points to talk about, and our analysis is sometimes weak when it comes to talking about these things. So best of luck for Thursday. Remember that you can look at unseen poetry past papers. We've posted lots of them for you, and let us know if you have any questions.